Welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Siobhan Brown. I'm a member of the SWP in East London and I'm going to be chairing this meeting. Speaking today we have Donny Gluckstein on A People's History of the Second World War.
There's something different about World War II. If you think about other wars that a lot of you have lived through, not all of them, I hope that you've lived through First World War, but the First World War is remembered as a horrible war. You know, the image of, you've probably seen it, of blinded soldiers leading each other across the battlefield. It's seen as a horrible, desperate war. Usually the best thing that anybody can remember about World War I was when they stopped fighting and played football. Nobody would say that about World War II. You think about Vietnam, you know, the apocalypse now, the horror. You think about Iraq, now Afghanistan. Wars are recognised as horrible, bloody affairs and usually hated. Not World War II. World War II stands out as something different. World War II is seen as positive, heroic, but you can tell there's something rotten as well. And one little thing that's happened recently, I don't know if people saw that they've erected a monument to Bomber Command. It took them 67 years to do it, and you have to ask yourself why. Because after all, Bomber Command, 1/3 of the entire British economy was turned over to providing these planes. Really from the beginning of the war till 1944, all that Britain did in terms of fighting the Germans was bombing the hell out of German civilians. But they didn't want to talk about it. Now they feel perhaps 67 years apart, you can actually put up a monument. So while it's generally seen as positive, you can tell there's something suspicious about this war. And really, I think anybody that approaches World War II has that problem. Because on the one hand, you could describe it very easily as an imperialist war. It is a war just like the First World War and Afghanistan and Vietnam and Korea and all the rest of it. It's an imperialist war. At the same time, it was the war to stop Hitler. It was the war to defeat Mussolini. It was the war to end the Holocaust. And the fact, and there's a seat just over there, late comer, the fact that it has these two sides, I think it's something we need to get to grips with, and that's why, in a sense, I wanted to look into it and try and get beyond the discussion, because there's been a huge amount of description. There's some marvellous books, don't get me wrong. Anthony Beevor, even Max Hastings, politically horrible, but writes very good books about World War II. So there's no lack of writing about World War II. There's no lack of films about World War II. If you look at all the war films that have ever been done, over half of them, and so that's covering all the wars from the ancient Romans to science fiction, World War II is over half of them. So there's a fascination, but there's not really an analysis. And what I think we need is an analysis. So let's start off. First of all, was it a war to stop fascism? Was it a war to end Hitler and all the rest of it? Well, if you look at the people who were in charge of it, you very quickly discover it wasn't. I mean, this is Churchill addressing Mussolini in 1927. If I had been an Italian, I am sure that I should have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to finish in your triumphant struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism. Your movement has rendered service to the whole world. She has provided the necessary antidotes to the Russian poison. So Churchill was very clear. Mussolini is a great man. He was actually heartbroken when Mussolini was strung up by the partisans and finished off. He said, actually, we could have worked with this guy. He supported Franco when in the Spanish Civil War, and when the war ended and the Second World War ended, and people said, all right, this was supposed to be a war against fascism, Franco's a fascist, he's still in power in Spain, what are you going to do about him? Churchill said, don't touch him. He's part of Christendom. We don't, he's on our side. So Churchill was no anti-fascist by any means. He was actually a fascist supporter when it came to the international, solution to the antidote to the Russian poison. What about Stalin? Was Stalin in there as a consistent anti-fascist? No, remember the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The Hitler-Stalin Pact, just before the war, and when Hitler heard about it, apparently he went banging the wall saying, I have the world in my pocket. He was so excited by this deal that he did with Stalin. Stalin supplied him with raw materials, Hitler supplied Stalin with weapons. They did a deal, and we'll have a look at the deal when I talk about Poland. What about the USA? Is this, you know, the war for freedom and democracy? Think about the USA and what it did after the Second World War. It used the Second World War as a means to thrust itself up to be the world superpower, you know, the horrible imperialist force that it has been ever since. These countries were not fighting an anti-fascist war. Okay, just one interesting little example. You know, we're told that the war was a war to stop world domination. Well, Hitler did conquer a lot. Hitler managed to, roughly speaking, conquer 350 million people. But he never got near the British Empire. The British Empire conquered 450 million people. So in terms of ending world domination, I wouldn't argue that Hitler was trying to end world domination by fighting Britain. But the idea that either side was trying to end world domination is complete and utter rubbish, and very, very clearly so. But that's not the only thing that was going on in World War II. There's something else that's going on in World War II, and that is the war of ordinary people. Because while Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin might be fighting their war, and it's a war between rival imperialisms, ordinary people aren't fighting for that. They're not fighting for imperialism, or at least they don't think they are. They don't see it that way at all. They're fighting, especially if you're under Nazi occupation, you're fighting the Nazis for liberation. In Britain, people went to war because they hated fascism, they disliked fascism, they disliked Nazis, and they wanted it defeated. And so we have to differentiate between what the governments are doing and what ordinary people are fighting for. Why they are putting their lives on the line. And you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of people did put their lives on the line in that war and died. It was the most destructive war in history. 55 million people died. But you have to ask yourself, why were those people fighting? And it wasn't just because they were given orders. They were fighting for a reason. And so what we see is that there is a fight against fascism by ordinary people. There's a fight for imperialism between one group of imperialists and another at the top. How do we differentiate? Because nobody ever talks about two world wars. There were. I will argue that there were two completely different wars going on simultaneously between 1939 and 1945. But how can you differentiate between these two wars? It's quite difficult, because the general who gives the order to go and, you know, shoot might be an imperialist. The person who does the shooting might be an anti-imperialist. How can you tell where the divide is? And there is one way of doing it. And the way you can do it is by finding out where these two wars, which appear to be in parallel, actually come into conflict with each other. Where the imperialist and the anti-imperialist, who are fighting, you know, apparently the same enemy, actually come into conflict. And that's what my book attempts to do, to look at those places. And when I started on this, I thought, oh, it's going to be very, very rare, you know, few and far between to discover these examples. Actually, they're everywhere. So I'm not going to, there's 16 chapters in. I'm not going to go through 16 chapters, I haven't got the time. I'm going to go through 4 examples where you can see the imperialist war on the one hand and the anti-imperialist war on the other hand, the People's War, come into conflict. And I'll start off in France. France, major European power, with Britain, you know, the sort of the key imperialist power of the continent. Everybody thought they would put a big fight up against the Nazis. They were defeated in 5 weeks. Complete shock. Complete shock. And the question is, why? What happened? And what happened was, you need to go back a wee bit. In 1934, there was a fascist coup in France. It was defeated by mass demonstrations, mass opposition. It led to 1936 occupation of the factories, a huge swing to the left. In other words, there was a huge anti-fascist, left-wing, radical movement. And the upper class in France had a real problem. When Hitler invaded, they said, do we arm this mass movement of workers, radical workers, or not? And actually, they had a discussion. And General Weygand, who was in charge, who was French commander-in-chief, spoke to de Gaulle, and de Gaulle reports it in his memoirs. And he said he was really worried because French military organisation might collapse suddenly and give a free run to anarchy and revolution. And so he goes on to say, if only I was sure the Germans would leave me the force necessary for maintaining order. And he became convinced they would. And that's how Vichy was set up. Vichy, which took the bottom third of France, they came to the conclusion that the Nazis would help them keep down the working class, and so they did a deal. Germans, you can have the northern France, leave us the southern France, and we'll carry on exploiting the workers down here. We'd like to exploit all the workers, but 1/3 will do. Marshal Pétain was the head of Vichy. He tells de Gaulle, the only thing that we can do is end the war and negotiate, because the alternative is the Commune. And he's referring back to the Paris Commune. In other words, arming the workers and the danger that the workers will actually take power. So the ruling class makes their decision. The majority of the ruling class collapses and joins Vichy. De Gaulle didn't. De Gaulle went into opposition, went abroad and started the Free French. But in France itself, what does it mean? What it means is this, that if you fight the Nazis, you're also fighting your own ruling class. Because the ruling class is collaborating with the Nazis. That's what Vichy meant. And therefore, the struggle from below takes the form of a struggle for class liberation. And this applies to all the different liberation movements, all the resistance movements. There are communist control movements who you'd expect to use that rhetoric, but all the other ones did as well. I'll just read to you, this is a quote from Dastier's movement. Dastier was actually an aristocrat, but connected with trade unions and things like that. This is what he said. The war is about liberation from material servitude, hunger, squalor, liberation from the machine, liberation from economic servitude, and the unfair distribution of wealth, from crisis and from unemployment, liberation from social servitude, money, prejudice, and the selfishness of the possessors, which will be, we could do with that, couldn't we? That's what they were fighting for. So it was a war against the Nazis, war against foreign occupation, and a war for liberation from all of these things. And therefore, what I think you can say in France, and this applies generally, is that we're talking about a people's war. It's a war to defeat fascism, defeat foreign occupation, but it's also a war for social and economic liberation. Left politics, not absolutely clear, you know, it's not a thought out Marxist movement, but it's a people's war from below. And it takes a very different form to the conventional war. Guerrilla warfare, anti-hierarchical, etc. I'll develop this as we go through. What is de Gaulle fighting for? Because here we have, all right, we see what the people's war is from below. What is de Gaulle fighting for? And this is what this is quote. He's fighting, he first of all tries to establish a council for the defense of the French Empire. And he says, at numerous points in the French Empire, courageous men are standing up and are resolved to preserve France's colonies against those whose aim was subversion, in other words, the working class, against those whose aim was subversion and the determination to sidetrack the national resistance in the direction of revolution. So de Gaulle doesn't like the Germans, he wants an independent imperialist France, but he's afraid of the workers. How does this take shape in resistance? And it's quite interesting. On the ground in France, the resistance is dominated by the left. The Communist Party plays an important role once they hit the Stalingrad breaks. Sabotage, intelligence, escape networks. If you've seen Hello, Hello, you know all about all that. Ideological struggle. The circulation of the resistance press was 600,000 every day. Now, if you were caught with a newspaper by the Gestapo or by the milice, which was the Vichy equivalent, you're thrown in jail, you're tortured, a whole sort of horrible thing. 600,000 a day. 60,000 Communist Party members died. This was a war. This was a war from below for freedom from Nazi occupation, freedom from class rule, in a vague sort of way. De Gaulle tries to control the resistance, but what he doesn't want is liberation from within France itself. So his approach is, yes, I'm the leader of the Free French, I'm the leader of the resistance, and what I want you to do is wait until the Allied armies arrive. It's called attentism. You just wait until the Allied armies arrive. That's his approach. In France, of course, they are fighting. They're fighting every day. They're putting their lives on the line. His emissary, he sends a guy into France to actually make contact with the resistance. And this guy called Bidot, he writes loads and loads of telegrams to de Gaulle. De Gaulle never bothers to reply. And then one day, out of the blue, comes the reply, reduce traffic. In other words, de Gaulle wanted the resistance, but he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He just wanted it to wait and sit still until the Allies arrived. And there's a danger of a split between de Gaulle and resistance. They actually do follow completely separate lines. And then something happened in November 1942. It's called Operation Torch. And Operation Torch was a plan to, and they did it, to land the Allied armies, Anglo-American armies in North Africa, French North Africa, and launch an attack across the Mediterranean later on. In preparation for this attack, the French resistance goes into action in Algiers. And it was led actually by a pair of Jewish brothers, the Abdelkader brothers. They organised the resistance, they rose up and they arrested all the Vichy officials and put them in jail. So that when the Anglo-American armies arrived, no opposition at all. They just march into Algiers, the way is completely open. So the Americans arrive, and what do? They say thank you very much to the resistance. They walk straight past them and they go to visit one of the prisoners. And the prisoner is a guy called Admiral Darlan. Admiral Darlan was number 2 in the Vichy regime. And the Americans immediately put Admiral Darlan, who'd just been in jail, back in charge of French North Africa. This was such a shock to the resistance. And they, by the way, they imprisoned the resistance fighters that welcomed their way in. It was such a shock that from now on there's a solidarity between the de Gaulle and the resistance. They're all afraid of what the Americans have got prepared for them if they're collaborating with Vichy so closely. So they're working together. But then the differences come out again. And this happens in June 1944 rather, with the D-Day landings. June 1944, you know the Normandy beaches and all that sort of stuff. The Americans, the British, and the French, Free French, arrive on the beaches. And de Gaulle puts out a message. Remember, he's an attentist. He wants people to wait. He sends a message to Paris and says, do not rise against the Germans. Wait for me to arrive. The resistance in Paris says, no, we do not want the Germans to retreat in good order back to Germany and carry on fighting. We're going to take on the Germans now. And you've got a race. The race is between de Gaulle's forces rushing from the Normandy beaches to get to Paris to stop the resistance liberating Paris before they arrive. The resistance ignores that. They liberate Paris. They kill several thousand Nazis, stop the German army. De Gaulle arrives and he's absolutely furious. So what's he do? I'll tell you what he does. First of all, he meets the head of the French police, who's been holding down the French population. Then he meets the governor of the Bank of France. And then he goes on a long procession through Paris. And the resistance is expecting to meet him at the Hotel de Ville, the town hall. He goes straight past it and into Notre Dame. Notre Dame represents the Catholic Church, tradition, and all that sort of stuff. He makes a 3-hour speech about the liberation of Paris and fails to mention the resistance. The resistance has liberated Paris. He deliberately snubbed them, and then he turns around to them immediately afterwards and said, you are to dissolve. And because the communists were following Stalin's policies, they did dissolve. But you can see the two wars at work there. I want to move very quickly now on to Greece. Greece, again, a little bit of background. Greece was run by King George, relative of Prince Philip and all that stuff. They're all part of that family. He was a fascist. Surprise, surprise. In 1936, King George brought into power a guy called General John Metaxas. And Metaxas consciously modelled himself on Hitler. Hitler had the Third Reich. Metaxas had the Third Hellenic civilization. It was an absolute, conscious model. At the beginning of the Second World War, what happened was the Italians, who were Hitler's allies, thought Greece would be a nice conquest. They invade Greece. So the fascists in Greece had to choose between being conquered by Mussolini or joining the British side. So they joined the British side. King George goes into exile into Cairo under British protection, and so that's how the war begins. The Italians didn't do all that well. The Germans have to come in to back them up, and so the Germans are now occupying Greece. There are two resistance movements. ILAS, which is basically the Communist Party-controlled resistance, and EDES, which is a British-backed one. What does EDES do? EDES, the British-backed resistance, spends more time fighting ILAS than it does fighting the Nazis, because we don't want Greece to be liberated by communists. In 1940-41, there's a terrible famine. 300,000 starved to death in Athens. It's because basically the Germans were hauling food and stuff out of Greece. This is out of a 7 million population, 300,000 starved to death. And the resistance movement, ILAS, the communist-dominated one, because they're actually fighting the Nazis rather than fighting each other, become absolutely dominant. And this is, I just want to read you a quote to give you the sense of what this fight from below is about. And this quote is from a British liaison officer, a very right-wing British liaison officer who detests ELAS, but he has to admit the following. ELAS justified their predominance, though not their tyranny, he has to say that. Having acquired control of almost the whole country, except the principal communications used by the Germans, ELAS gave Greece things it had never known before. Communications in the mountains by wireless courier and telephone have never been so good before or since. The benefits of civilization and culture trickle into the mountains for the first time. Schools, local government, law courts, public utilities, which then worked again. All the virtues and vices, he has to say that, all the virtues and vices of such an experiment can be seen. For when the people whom no one has ever helped before start helping themselves, their methods are vigorous, though not always nice. The words liberation and popular democracy fill the air with their peculiar connotations. So that's what is happening. It's liberation from below. They're fighting the Nazis and they're freeing themselves in the process. What do the British do? The British adopt a very, very, very strange policy because the British want to bring King George, the fascist King George, back. They don't want ELAS to win. So what they do, and the quote I'm going to read you now is from a German officer. And this is what the German officer says. He says, something strange is happening. They have allowed our forces, our German forces, to move from the islands to the mainland with no opposition, by sea or by air. How can we explain this? They intend to keep German forces on the Greek mainland until the moment when their own operation is possible, and in this way to prevent general revolution. In other words, the British are helping the Germans to remain in Greece until Britain is ready to move in and take over directly. So, it doesn't work. The ELAS was too strong. They kicked the Germans out 3 weeks before the British were ready to move in. So when the British arrive, ELAS has liberated mainland Greece and they are in control. So what does Churchill do? He sends in the army. And this is a quote from him. Do not hesitate to fire at any armed male in Athens who assails British authority or Greek authority. Act as if you are in a conquered city where a local rebellion is in progress. And that's exactly what they did. General Alexander says, we could go quicker if we stormed our way through the streets with tanks and Rotterdam the whole quarters by air bombardment, as the Germans and Russians would no doubt do. But our troops refused to do so. So they couldn't do it directly on the ground, so they sent in the RAF. In 24 hours, the first 24 hours of British attack, 2,500 shells are fired into the residential, this is the working class area of Athens, 13,700 casualties are caused. By the end of this particular operation, 50,000 of Greek are dead, and there's 2,000 British casualties. This was Britain declaring war on the People's War. Imperialist war declaring war on the People's War. This are the two wars going on in parallel. The American ambassador in Athens says that Churchill is acting as though he's in the British Raj, as though he's in India, as though it's one of his colonies. And he says, this is the American ambassador, behind the conflict stands those with possessions on the one hand, and those without possessions, the hungry, the homeless, on the other. It's a class war. So there are two wars, and it's a class war. So the British are unable to finish off ELAS, actually. ELAS was too strong. So they did a deal. And the deal was, ELAS disarms and will have general elections. ELAS disarmed. They had a general election, but it was completely fixed, and I'll tell you why. Because what the British did is they armed the security battalions. Now the security battalions were a group who'd operated under Nazi rule and had been, this was their oath of allegiance, to the security battalions. I swear by God, this sacred oath, that I will obey absolutely the orders of the Supreme Commander of the German Army, Adolf Hitler. These are the people that the British armed to put down ELAS. And that's what they did. You get, within 1 year, 1,289 people murdered, 6,671 wounded, 84,931 arrested, and so on it goes. It's not over yet. There's a civil war. 168,000 people die in this civil war. So when we talk about two wars, we are really talking about two wars, not one. An imperialist war and a people's war. I want to move on now to Poland. Because the danger is, you could see this as, well, it's sort of right-wing Churchill against the communists. Let's see how the communists, and when I mean communists, I don't mean the ordinary communists in Western Europe or in the resistance movements, the working class communists. Let's see how the Russian state, Stalin, Stalin's state operated. And a lot of people in the SWP call this state capitalism. How did Stalin operate? In 1939, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and the Hitler-Stalin Pact was we divide up Poland, and so Poland is split 48% to Germany, 52% goes to Russia. What did the Hitler do? Hitler shifted 900,000 people. Obviously the Holocaust takes place, millions of people are destroyed by that. In some areas of Poland, speaking Polish is banned. Polish children are to learn only how to write their names, count up to 500, and know it is God's command they should be obedient to Germany, thanks. So, that's what the Germans do to Poland. What do the Russians do? Well, you might have heard of the Katyn massacre where they killed about 20,000 Polish officers. What you don't hear is that actually 1 in 10 of the population, 2 million people, were shipped, were transported out away from Poland. There was mass deportation by Stalin of the population because this was supposed to be Russia from now on. And so it's an absolute disaster. In that situation you get resistance. Resistance to both Russia and to Germany. And this is the Polish Home Army. 380,000 people, the biggest of the resistance armies actually. 25,000 acts of sabotage carried out in 3 years. They killed, by 1945, 150,000 German soldiers. This is mass resistance. It's a resistance of both upper class and lower class, because neither the Russians nor the Germans will give any space for either the upper class or the working class of Poland. So it's actually a united resistance of both classes, and they take on both sides in war. Eventually, it comes to a point in 1944, and just to explain the immediate background to this, what's happened is that Hitler has broken the Hitler-Stalin Pact, conquered the whole of Poland and gone on to attack Russia. So now there is only one enemy, and that's Germany. So the Poles are fighting the Germans. They hear that the Red Army is approaching. The Red Army is pushing back into Poland, and they've reached the River Vistula. The River Vistula runs, on one side of it is the main part of Poland, Warsaw, on the other side is a small suburb. The Russians have arrived at that river on the other side from the main town. At this moment, the resistance says, we're going to rise. This is our chance. Our friends, they're supposed to be our allies, are just over the river. We will take on the Nazis and defeat them. They had guns for 1 week. They knew that they could hold out for 1 week, but just over the river, the Russians won't take the Russians long to arrive. They rise up. Just to give you a description of it, Home Army officer, part of the resistance, describes the fervour with which the inhabitants build anti-tank barricades, organised soup kitchens at short notice to feed the soldiers. People who weren't able to return to their homes and caught where the uprising had surprised them get stuck in. The mood in the street reminded one of a continuous holiday. Everyone in their own way and within their own limits of their ability took part in this decisive struggle. Women, men, young, old, this was, if you wanted popular war, this was popular war. What happened? Well, they fought, they died, and the Russians crossed their arms on the other side of the river and watched. Because the Russians didn't want an independent Poland. The Russians wanted to conquer Poland. So let the resistance rise up and let them be destroyed. And that was what the Russians did. The British and the US support Polish independence because they don't want Russia to control Poland. So they actually said to Stalin, look, Stalin, you're not helping, let us help, we'll do some airdrops. Our problem though, and this is true, is that our bases are in Italy, 1,250 kilometers away. So if we're going to do airdrops from that distance, it's going to be difficult unless we can refuel. You've got airstrips 30 kilometers away from Warsaw. Can we fly from Italy, drop our supplies and refuel in 30 kilometers away? Stalin says, no, you can't. And so it was a disaster. The Warsaw Uprising went down, quarter of the Home Army were killed, 200,000 were dead. Poland lost the biggest proportion of any country in the whole of the Second World War. 1 in 6 of the population were dead. It was terrible. But you can see again People's War versus Imperialist War. In this case, Imperialist War from the Russian point of view, from the so-called communist point of view, actually state capitalist. I want to move on to my last example. I think I've just got time for that. Yeah, which is Indonesia. The colonies are seen as something somewhere else. What have they got to do with the Second World War? This is in Europe, no, or whatever. No, Indonesia is part of this process as well, and it takes these ideas towards its logical conclusion. Because what we find is Allied rulers and Axis rulers working together to destroy resistance from below. Little bit of background again, very, very quickly. Indonesia was previously the Dutch East Indies, and the Dutch were absolutely brutal in their rule of that part of the world. So when the Japanese arrived in 1942, the population actually thinks nothing could be worse. They welcomed the Japanese. The Japanese were terrible. The Japanese took 40% of the small farmers' rice crop. Hundreds of thousands, millions actually, were taken as slave labourers in this program called Romusha, was a sort of forced slave labour abroad. 50% of them never came back. Japan's treatment of prisoners was actually worse than in Europe. In Europe, if you went into German or Italian POW camp, 4% died, 96% survived. In Japan, it was 27% died. So, Japanese rule was vicious. When the war ends, VJ Day, 16th of August, 1945, the Dutch, the previous colonial owners, are in no position to come back because the Dutch have been occupied by the Nazis. So the Dutch can't come back and take possession of their land. So Britain is given the job. Britain is given the job. And so they're supposed to take Indonesia. It's a very big place, Indonesia. And the problem they have is they haven't the strength to actually hold down, like they did in Athens, for example. They haven't got the strength to do that on their own. Who can they depend on? The Japanese. So they turn to the Japanese and say, will you help us hold down the Indonesians so we can bring back the Dutch rulers? And the Japanese do exactly that. But what are the ordinary people doing? On the 1st of September, a youth council in Jakarta calls on all enterprises, and this is what happened, offices, factories, mines, plantations must be seized from the Japanese. And in the next fortnight, they take the radio, the railway, the trams, etc. In Semarang, they take over most of the buildings. In Surabaya, which is the big oil refinery, exactly the same thing happens. So there's a revolution from below for independence from the Dutch and the Japanese and everybody else, and for social change at home. So what takes place? Well, in Semarang, which I mentioned before, the Japanese attack the Indonesians. 2,000 Indonesians are killed at a price of 500 Japanese. Christensen, who was the British commander, recommends one of the Japanese majors for a distinguished service order. He didn't get it because it was a bit too embarrassing, but that's what they wanted, because they're helping the British. One of the British soldiers writes to Ernest Bevin, who was the Foreign Secretary, he writes, because this is under a Labour government, by the way, by this time, 2 Japanese sentries stand at my billet door as I write, armed with loaded British rifles and a Bren machine gun with 13 full magazines. We sleep, in other words, the British soldiers are being defended while they sleep by Japanese soldiers. We sleep securely, thinking, hell, have we descended to this? Our tortured POW comrades must be writhing in their jungle graves. What did they die for? So the Japanese were helping the British, but the British also did their own. The British carried out huge atrocities. In Surabaya, the Indonesians had got hold of a number of arms. The British decided to disarm them. There was a fight, and Christensen, remember the guy that wanted the Distinguished Service Order, says, I intend to bring the whole weight of my sea, land and air forces and all the weapons of modern war against them until they are crushed. And that's exactly what he did. 30,000 British soldiers, 21 Sherman tanks, 8 Thunderbolts planes, 16 Mosquito, 6,000 Mosquito planes, 6,000 Indonesians killed. But in the end, the Indonesian liberation movement was too strong, and Indonesia got its independence. It took a couple more years, 1947, but they got their independence. So I've given you 4 examples of where imperialist war and people's war not only went in parallel, actually they came to blows. They didn't come to blows in exactly the same place everywhere, but fundamentally these are the 2 currents that are taking place. So it's not one war, World War II, it is 2 wars. A war from below for liberation and independence and freedom and social change and all of those sorts of things we said earlier, from the liberation from the machine, servitude and squalor and greed, and control by imperialism. In this case, a new set of imperialists, fundamentally the Russians and the US. What happened to the 2 wars? Well, they continued. You get the Cold War, so the imperialist rivalry continues through the Cold War. You also get the struggle from below. The welfare states, all the concessions that the ruling class had to make to stay in power, because the push from below was a powerful one. So these things carry on through into peacetime. End of empires. It's another product of the Second World War. And it didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because of the generosity of the colonial rulers. It happened because from below people were fighting back. And as I say, welfare states and all these sorts of things. So is there anything left of this two struggle? Is there something that we can look at today? And quite interestingly, there is. On the one hand, you have imperialism. We've seen it. You see it every day. You turn on the television. Will they attack Iran? They are in Afghanistan. You know what they did in Iraq. That imperialist current has carried on, but so has the struggle from below, the resistance. And there's one very, very nice, I think it's a nice little connection between World War II and today. And that's a guy called Stefan Hessel. Now, Stefan Hessel was a resistance fighter in the Second World War in France. And he wrote recently, I think it was about 2009, 2010, a pamphlet. He's French, so it was called Indignez-vous, which means be indignant. And the Spanish picked it up. The Indignados took it from a French resistor, they took it up, and it spread to the Occupy movement, and it spread all over the world. In other words, we do have world imperialism, and we have a struggle from below. So what we saw in World War II is not something out of our experience, it's actually very much part of our experience today.
Okay, we've got about half an hour now for discussion.
I just want to draw attention to the connection between the soldiers who are fighting that, the ordinary, who are also fighting the People's War, I think, to some extent, and the resistance. There's a guy who used to be a bus inspector in Barking Bus Garage during the 1982 strike. His name was Bill Sparks. He's dead. He's probably better known as one of the Copper Shell heroes, one of the paratroopers who took part in a commando raid in, I think, 1942. And the commando raid was to sink some ships, and they half succeeded, but then got chased by the Gestapo through France. And Bill got a DSO, which when he retired from London Transport, he had to sell. A terrible thing he had to do. He writes this in his autobiography. It was a terrible thing because he felt he'd earned this, and I think it might have been bought by that bastard Ashcroft, who goes around buying medals. The chair of the fucking Tory party. But with the money, Bill got about 30 grand. He needed it to pay off his mortgage because his wife was ill and inflation, mortgage rates were going up. But what he did do, he went back to France, because as he got chased through France, he was looked after by the resistance, by the Communist Party, I assume. And I think he paid for a memorial, the only memorial, as far as I'm aware, to the French resistance anywhere in France, to those people who died, because as the Gestapo come down, they tortured, they followed the trail and tortured those resistance fighters. And there's a beautiful picture of him, in front of this memorial a few years before he died. And, you just think, it says it all, that sort of story. The second story is about the Black Liberators, which there's a film on BBC 4 about, Channel 4 about this. This is the black soldiers who were in a tank regiment, who fought their way through France under Patton. There's all sorts of contradictions here, but